Thank you, Amy, for playing that song, get us all going. So thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you, Professor Pernard, for being here. Very excited. We're also honored to have Administrator Liz Ryan, who will be providing remarks shortly. But first, I want to introduce you all to our program and, of course, our moderator. So today is May 17th. This is the anniversary of the Brown v. Board decision that nearly 70 years ago promised all youth equal education, equal educational experiences, regardless of race. And additionally, this past May 15th, anniversary of the In re Gault decision, which promises youth access to due process of the law and defense representation. We recognize that we have yet to fulfill these promises for young people, and it is my pleasure to welcome this panel of zealous youth defenders from all around the country who are actively working on the front lines to obstruct the school to prison pipeline. So before we get started, I will introduce Professor Pernard, who will be moderating our panel today. Thank you so much for being here. Michael Pernard is the Francis and Harriet Eaglehart Professor of Law at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law, where he teaches the Youth Education and Justice Clinic. The efforts of his students have been critical to policy changes and the passage of important legislative bills in Maryland, many aimed at increasing employment opportunities, housing options, and citizenship rights for individuals with criminal records. He's also co-editor-in-chief of the Clinical Law Review and serves on the Clinical Skills Committee of the American Bar Association section on legal education and admissions to the bar. He's also one of our board members here at the Gault Center, and we're deeply grateful to him and the guidance he's provided us over the past 3 years. I'll turn it over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Katrina, and it's certainly an honor for me to be here, and just an honor to be in conversation with these four amazing folks who I will introduce you to very soon. So just to reiterate, in Brown versus Board, the Supreme Court held unanimously that racial segregation of public school children is unconstitutional under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And the court found that, quote, separate education facilities are inherently unequal, and therefore separating children, quote, because of their race, generates a feeling of inferiority that is unlikely ever to be undone. The court highlighted that education is a, quote, foundation of good citizenship. So that's Brown versus Board. A year later, there's another Brown case, Brown 2, which is about how local school districts would implement the court's decision just 1 year earlier. So in Brown 2, instead of mandating that schools integrate immediately, the Supreme Court ordered schools to do so with, quote, all deliberate speed. And so the clear signal to school systems, or at least the signal that many school systems took from that decision, was to move at their own pace, or not at all. So here we are 70 years later, and schools are still segregated along racial, ethnic, socioeconomic lines. In the 2021 school year, approximately 15% of public school students in the United States attended schools where almost the entire student body was the same race or ethnicity. According to the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, today, there are more than 200 school desegregation cases that remain open on federal court dockets. So as was true before Brown versus Board, Black and Brown youth are treated separately and unequally in their schools today across a variety of dimensions. Literally, they are educated at the margins of or in the midst of the juvenile and criminal legal systems. They attend school burdened by the weight of narratives that criminalize them from their earliest years. So it was in the 1990s that we saw the explosion of school disciplinary policies and practices that hyper-criminalized Black and Brown children in their schools and funneled them into the juvenile and criminal legal system. So during this notorious decade, laws were enacted that protected children less and exposed them more. And so not much has changed. So here we are 30 years removed from the 1990s, and we still have harsh school discipline punishment for children, but particularly so for Black and Brown youth, as well as youth with disabilities. So here today, we will listen to 4 youth defenders who are fighting to defend children who are funneled into the school to prison pipeline. So I will give very short intros that really do not do justice to any of them. They will then speak for a couple of minutes each about the relevance of Brown to their work, and then we will engage from there. So Angela Chang is the director of the Youth Defense Division of the Hamilton County Public Defender, where she has been a youth defender since 2015. Angela began her legal career representing individuals in both misdemeanor and felony cases as a deputy state public defender for the Office of the Colorado State Public Defender. From 2010 to 2015, Angela focused on youth justice issues at the Children's Law Center, Inc., where she coordinated youth defense trainings for hundreds of youth defense attorneys, worked on policy reforms, and provided technical assistance and support to youth defense attorneys in the region. And Angela has presented on a wide variety of youth topics across the country, and is a certified youth defense advocacy program trainer. Taoufik Hassan is the first education advocacy attorney in the Juvenile Justice Division of the Cook County Public Defender, where he's been defending court-involved youth since August 2020. Before law school, Taoufik served middle and high school students, mostly from low-income communities, as a wellness and physical education teacher. And during his time at Brooklyn Law School, Taoufik was a board member of the Suspension Representation Project, where he advocated for youth facing superintendent suspensions and coordinated trainings for new members. And after law school, he returned to Chicago, where he continues to be a change agent for youth by representing them in reentry matters, discipline hearings, special education, other legal proceedings affecting their education. We also have with us Brittany Mobley, and Brittany is the Juvenile Services Program Deputy Chief within the Community Defender Division of the Public Defender Service, which we all know as PDS. And she joined the Juvenile Service Program for PDS in July 2015 as a staff attorney. Prior to going to PDS, Brittany was a senior attorney at the Children's Law Center with the Guardian Ad Litem program, where she represented children in the family regulation system for 4 years. Brittany is the co-chair of the Juvenile Justice Committee of the American Bar Association. She is an advisory board member for the Mid-Atlantic region of the Gault Center. She's a founding member and national secretary of the Black Public Defender Association. And perhaps more importantly, at least I'll say it this way, she is also a proud alumna of the 2021 Ambassador for Racial Justice cohort. And last, we have Chris Saylor, who is the Director of Education Advocacy for the Knox County Defender Public Defenders Community Law Office. There, Chris represents children in school, disciplinary, and special education proceedings. Previously, Chris founded and directed Defend Ed, which is a youth special advocacy project at the Harris County, Texas Public Defender's Office. Defend Ed provided holistic educational, healthcare, and housing advocacy for teens facing delinquency charges. Before law school, Chris was a professional educator who taught in public high schools across 4 states. So now you know a little bit more about them, and let's get to why everyone joined this webinar. So first question is to all of you, and Angela, we could start with you. And this question is, how do you find Brown to be relevant to your work today?
Yeah, absolutely. So as a youth defender in Cincinnati, I will first say that we are a city that has deeply rooted segregation, and that is still true and seen in the way that our neighborhoods are formed and where kids go to school. We have a very large public school district for the city of Cincinnati, and it is over-policed, and which leads to a lot of referrals from school to the court system. And we have a prosecutor who currently, previously as a juvenile court judge, has publicly stated that there is no such thing as a school to prison pipeline. So that is the climate that I practice in here. But I see the I guess unfulfilled promise of Brown in how kids experience school, Black and brown kids experience school day to day. So whether it is that I see as a defender that they have a history of school push out, which then leads to them being in places where they get charged and policed with crimes. So just for small things, for example, today I had a case where a kid was sent to court because she threw water at somebody. Like, that's still happening, right? And this would not happen in a school that's predominantly white or not policed. Unfortunately, in terms of police contacts in general, we recently looked at some contact data from the Cincinnati Police Department, and while Black youth are still a minority in our county or the city, they represent about 70+% of the contacts that police have day to day with citizens. So that's to give you an idea of what that looks like in public. But then in the Cincinnati public schools, the police department actually controls the contract and what they do and how police make decisions. And we see that a lot of school referrals, a lot of school push out, which can be resulting in charges that we see, or it is kind of in the background and then used against the child because they have these other school related issues.
Thank you. And we will get back to the what your client experienced today later on, because I think that needs to be elevated as well. Okay, how about Taufik? How about you? Again, how do you find Brown to be relevant to your work?
Yeah, similar to what Angela said, me being in Chicago, a very large city, the biggest school district, CPS, Chicago Public Schools, is where a lot of students that I see face reentry issues. Well, when they do get put into these situations where they become court involved, I see students where they are released and then they're trying to return back to their community schools. They begin to, you see pushback from school administrators where they're referring them to alternative schools or option schools. And then they preface the conversation by letting these families know, like, we're doing you a favor by putting you on a path where you can easily graduate high school or go to the next level of your grade by going to this school. And these students, they see this and they say, well, if I have less, credits on the path to recovery, it's a lot easier at this school. All right, I'll go to this school. And they decide to go to these schools, and then they realize these schools are underfunded, under-resourced, and they begin to just not have a positive engagement at school. And that leads to them not wanting to go to school, and then that leads to recidivism where they're just not going to school, and then,
Thank you so much. No, sorry.
Yeah.
You done? Okay, you faded in and out for me, so I didn't know.
No, I'm sorry. No. But yeah, I see reentry issues, and then as far as just discipline issues. Yeah, I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
For me, it's a little touch and go, but I can hear most of what you're saying. Just okay. Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, I'll just end with that. I'm sorry. Let me make sure my audio is fine.
That audio there was great. So we'll get back to you. So Brittany, how about you again? How do you find Brown to be relevant to your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you started all of this, right, the purpose of Brown was to desegregate schools. I work in the District of Columbia. I represent some amazing young people in DC. And although the District of Columbia used to be very commonly referred to as Chocolate City, I don't see a lot of this Chocolate City merging with a lot of non-Black kids, right? The majority of my client population who I represent are Black youth. And I say the majority, the last stats we had were about 98% Black youth in the juvenile legal system in DC. And the remaining youth were really brown kids, right? Like, so we're very clear in DC as to the type of young people that we are pushing deeper into this carceral setting. But this desegregation, right, that Brown did, and we are so happy to see, Brown 1 did, we had to do a Brown 2 again to really make sure states and jurisdictions were listening. In DC, we see just completely segregated school systems, right? When in Ward 8, that is the more under-resourced, over-policed, similar as, Angela and Tawfiq have mentioned, right? Parts of our city. And those are those kids who have those under-resourced areas and those under-resourced schools. Those are Black youth we're talking about, right? So when I see Brown show up in my work as, this hope to end this notion of separate but equal, because that wasn't true. I still see it exist modern day, right? And we're seeing it particularly impact poor communities, poor Black communities in our city. And another thing I would just really highlight, I had a call earlier today, again, trying to put us in real time, right? We're on May 15th, May 17th in 2023. And a meeting today where I spoke with an educator of a school who was talking about how their school is getting 3 special education positions cut. But what we also know, right? There's this national conversation about putting more money into policing. And we're seeing just today, I'm getting news that a school who has high representation of kids and students with disabilities, their services for special educators are getting cut. We're not putting money and investing in those resources for our young people. So I'm seeing Brown shake out and absolutely be not followed, not adhered to. And we're seeing it in the work as being youth defenders, because our Black and Brown youth are pushed deep into this school to prison pipeline that does exist. They're being spat out the other end of it with no resources, and it's the system's fault. We witness it happen regularly.
Thank you so much, Chris. How about in Tennessee?
Yeah, so Brown asserted this legal principle, right, that separate is inherently unequal when it comes to public education, and I'd like to say that that's sort of the biggest legacy of Brown that I see in my work. But it's actually, I think, sort of another consequence that came after Brown that most affects my work, and that's actually massive resistance, right? So in the South, after Brown, right, we had massive resistance to integration of schools. And at first, what that looked like was, even entire school systems, right, shutting down so that integration wouldn't have to happen. Thankfully, we don't see that kind of resistance today, at least not in Tennessee. But I think that we still see massive resistance of a very different character in the district that I work in. So just to give a bit of context, I'm in Knoxville, Tennessee. Knox County is a predominantly white, predominantly rural county, actually, in the east of Tennessee in the Appalachian Mountains. And so even though, Black children are maybe 9% of the county population, we're seeing about 50% of the arrests in my county being Black children, Black and Brown children, primarily Black. We don't have a huge, population of Asian or Hispanic kids in our county. But, what I think massive resistance has come to look like, particularly in my jurisdiction, is this idea that we have, good minority youth who maybe it's okay that they're here in the building, and then, all the quote unquote bad ones, right, who are threats to the other kids. And we see, I think I see a lot of, bias kind of infecting how the adults in the building are viewing the kids that I represent. And there comes out of that this very passionate resistance that I experience in disciplinary hearings and even in special education proceedings that says, well, we need these kids someplace else. They can't be here in this building because even though, yes, this is going to limit their opportunity to move them to an alternative school, or actually in Tennessee, I have some kids who don't get any school whatsoever because we have no right to education in our state. So if you are expelled, you may get no schooling, period. What I hear, educators saying is, well, yes, that is a tragedy, but these kids are a threat. And I've even had a very high-ranking member of our school hierarchy tell me that point blank to my face. Well, the kids you represent are threats to the other kids, and we have to keep them out of our buildings. And that's the kind of resistance that I see playing out. And of course, it's I think not coincidental then that many of the kids who are experiencing that kind of exclusion are, of course, kids of color. And so I think that's unfortunately where we are in my jurisdiction.
Well, So thank you all for that, for those opening remarks. And obviously there's a lot to chew on. I do see that Liz Ryan is present at this point. So I'll turn it over to Katrina, then we'll come back to the conversation.
Thank you. And thank you for those introductory remarks, all of our panelists. Very, very important to see the impact Brown is continuing to have or not have in these jurisdictions. So next, we're honored to have Administrator Liz Ryan, who will be providing a few remarks today about the importance of ending the school to prison pipeline, racial injustice in school discipline and juvenile justice, and of course, the ongoing ways OJJDP continues to support efforts that afford the promises of Brown and Gault. So before you begin, let me introduce you. I'm sure everyone here knows you, but I'll read a little bit about your background. Liz Ryan is the administrator of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. Prior to leading OJJDP, Administrator Ryan served as president and CEO of the Youth First Initiative, a national campaign focused on ending the incarceration of youth by investing in community-based alternatives. She founded the Youth Campaign for Youth Justice in 2005 and served as its president and CEO until 2014. This national multi-state initiative sought to end the prosecution of youth in adult criminal courts and the placement of youth in adult jails and prisons. During her tenure, the campaign's work led to legislative and policy changes in more than 30 states, a 60% decrease in the number of youth in adult courts, and a greater than 50% decrease in the number of youth placed in jails, adult jails, and prisons. A staunch advocate for youth, Administrator Ryan co-founded and co-chaired the Act for Juvenile Justice, a campaign to reauthorize the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. She also served as Advocacy Director for the Youth Law Center, National Field Director for OJJDP's Juvenile Court Centennial Initiative, and as an advocate for the Children's Defense Fund. She's written extensively about juvenile justice reform, including articles, editorials, reports, chapters of books. So thank you so much for being here, and I'll turn it over to you, Administrator Ryan.
Thank you so much for having me this afternoon. I want to thank the Gault Center for inviting me to speak at this webinar. OJJDP is extremely proud of the long partnership we have had with the center. So today we mark two momentous anniversaries. First, we acknowledge the anniversary of In Re Gault, the namesake for the Gault Center. Earlier this week, we observed the 56th anniversary of this monumental case, which held that youth defendants in juvenile courts are entitled to due process under the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, including the right to confront witnesses and the right to counsel guaranteed by the 6th Amendment, just as adults are in criminal court. Sadly, as you know, this right is still consistently not met by the patchwork of youth defense systems across the nation. Young people are still in court every day in this country, alone, uninformed, and unprepared to defend their future and their freedom. In fact, research funded by OJJDP indicates that less than half of all youth in custody and just 50% of youth in detention facilities report that they have a lawyer. This is simply unacceptable. OJJDP is working with the Gault Center and other partners, including practitioners across the nation, to finally fulfill the promise of Gault. In 2023, OJJDP will provide $2.4 million to states and localities through a combination of direct grants and national training and technical assistance to enhance juvenile indigent defense. I'm also proud to report that the Justice Department recently issued a Dear Colleague letter to state and local courts and juvenile justice agencies addressing the constitutional and legal issues and policy considerations related to juvenile and adult fines and fees. Notably, the letter states that jurisdictions should presume that children and youth under the jurisdiction of the juvenile justice system should be presumed indigent and unable to pay fines and fees. The second anniversary I want to acknowledge is, of course, Brown v. Board of Education. It's been 70 years since the Supreme Court declared that racial segregation in public schools violated the 14th Amendment. However, a recent government report shows that public schools remain highly segregated along racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic lines. Studies have found that students experiencing poverty and youth of color are more likely to attend underperforming schools with limited resources. These students may also experience harsh and exclusionary school disciplinary policies and in-school arrests that push youth out of school and into the justice system, a process known as the school to prison pipeline. We must address this inequity at its source so we keep more youth out of the juvenile justice system and in school. While we clearly have much work to do to make our juvenile justice system fair and just for all, I also want to acknowledge how important it is that we are all here. We're talking about and working on these issues. Most importantly, we're listening. Today, we'll hear from youth defenders who are on the front lines of these issues. By amplifying their voices and concerns, and by committing to work together, we can ensure that young people are afforded the rights guaranteed to them by the U.S. Constitution. Thank you all so much for being here and for working so hard for young people. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Administrator Ryan. We know, can only have a sense of how busy you are. So we certainly appreciate you taking the time for that sort of words in solidarity, if you will. And so we appreciate all the great work that you're doing, and we look forward to engaging you, particularly with all the great work you're doing now on behalf of children across this country. So thank you again for your time. And so want to just next ask, just going back to the panel, and again, those words should lift us all, right? That is, we have someone in that position who is definitely supportive of the work, and all of you all work on school to prison pipeline issues, somewhat from different vantage points. Some of it's very, very sort of meshes together, but some of it's very different in terms of the different stages. So Brittany, just going to go to you first, sort of the back end of the system, if you will, and you work on reentry and post-disposition issues, which are obviously crucial, right, to getting these children back into the education system. So just wondering, what hurdles do you see in your work in the context of getting children back into school?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, I work with kids kind of at this deeper end of the system and post-disposition advocacy. But my office also, the juvenile services program at PDS, we have offices inside of the youth detention centers, both the short-term stay facility akin to the juvenile jail and the longer-term facility, which is our local juvenile prison, but it's our local residential. So we get a unique insight as to what's happening while youth are experiencing education in detention, and how do we get them back in appropriate education settings once they are eventually returned to the community. So some of the biggest hurdles we see, and it's something that DC is consistently working on, is just kind of this, what happens, right, when education is disrupted by detention, right? So, various jurisdictions, we have judges and prosecutors who are detaining or asking for young people to be detained for after kids have missed school, right? So maybe they're being held on a charge, and the reason for them to be detained is because, they haven't been attending school regularly, so we're going to lock them up. Like that's a better way to improve educational access. But sometimes we'll see judges do this from the vantage point of, well, if they're locked up, I'll know that they will at least go to school in detention. So that is a big falsehood. And I think for a few different reasons, we learned a lot during this pandemic that young people were previously in detention settings getting undereducated. And during the pandemic, that proved even more challenging, right? Advocates were fighting tooth and nail to get kids access to education while in detention during a national health crisis. And we are now on kind of the downturn of seeing how is that being managed? How are we addressing that? In my local jurisdiction, we still regularly have young people being handed education packets. And these are kids with intensive IEPs being given packets so they could do work by themselves. Obviously not in accordance with any individualized education plan, right? Sure. Being told to, educate yourselves. That is not education. That is not, access to education. But then, we continue on down this pipeline. So once they get out of detention and out of or a residential or longer term facility, which also now has disrupted education, because we know the data and the research tells us that young people do best by accessing education and accessing most services in a community setting that's most akin to what their reality is. But, the system has now created a scenario in which a young person is detained or in a longer term facility, which disrupting their community education, but they eventually do have to return home. So a lot of things happen in really problematic ways, depending on where your young person is attending, where our clients are attending or in placement. They may have different credit requirements, right? Ultimately, as to where they may end up. So, it's not uncommon it has not been uncommon for me to have a client who may be sent away to a residential in Pennsylvania, right? Pretty far away from home in the district. They're sent to Pennsylvania and, are pushing through and, getting some credits. And maybe they think they're right on track to graduate. So when they come back to DC, they've only got a handful of credits left. But in DC, a graduation requirement is that you take DC history. I promise you, they're not giving DC history in Pennsylvania. So now I have a client faced with a situation where they've spent so much time, maybe they really did give it as their all, and they were really thinking, wow, I'm so close to education, to graduating. They get back to DC, and now they're so much farther behind than they were told. And how demoralizing is that for a young person that has just spent months, maybe over a year, of their freedom taken away from them, away from their home and family and community. And now they're told, we gave you this little glimmer of hope and we snatched it away, and no, you aren't going to graduate on time. And oftentimes I have seen kids just lose hope, right? Because how do they trust a process that has not been honest with them and that they've seen and experienced fail them for so long? So that's also some of the big things, this credit disconnect.
Yeah.
But I'll also just flag really quickly, right? For our young people, let's say we do have graduates, right? I just can't let this moment pass without acknowledging the fact as to how these carceral settings and juvenile legal system impacts young people in in achieving other higher education opportunities, right? There are some questions that may be asked as to whether I have to relay my juvenile legal history to potential higher education places, trade schools, right? Like, what judgment am I going to get on that? So this system is set up and designed in a way to consistently impact and create ongoing disparities for young people. And when these disparities happen, we know this is disparities for our Black and brown poor kids. That's really what this ultimately looks like. And that is absolutely not in the spirit of the Brown decision.
And just if I could add to that, there are colleges and graduate schools and licensing authorities, so the bar for one, that will ask about suspensions and expulsions as well. Talking about primary school and secondary school as well. So the point you made, I mean, obviously it's all, on point, but just really the breadth, if you will, of these interactions from school discipline, again, how this lasts a lifetime. Okay, so Taufik and then Chris, you work on, among the work you do, you represent children in expulsion appeals, right? As well. So on the appellate side, what are some hurdles you see to the work? Just if you could tell us more about what you experienced sort of on the appellate side, including how long that process takes.
Yeah, well, for me, it's a long process. One recent case, I have a client where we're in the process of appealing the expulsion. The expulsion length is 2 years. We didn't get our first court date until 6 months after filing the complaint. And my client is already in a year in the expulsion term. So we're really hoping to get a decision before next school year, because essentially this person, the student, is on his senior year. So it's last year of his high school career. It's really depending on his decision of whether he'll be able to go back to the general high school. But in regards to just expulsions, in general, at times I see clients who's right to confront the allegations being used by the school. They don't have that right sometimes. Sometimes they schedule these expulsion hearings while the client is in detention, and then they convince the parents that it's in their best interest to just hurry up and go through the process so a decision can be made and they can know what next best steps to take. But in reality, a lot of the times, these students, they have a right to be heard, and they have a right to, push back against what's being alleged and tell their narrative and tell their side of things. And just in this particular case, there was he had a right to be there. We rescheduled the expulsion hearing. We continued to reschedule. We had 2 reschedulings just so he can be there. But in the process, I see schools adding to the record after the expulsion hearing process is over in an appellate process, whereas they're trying to add evidence that wasn't submitted during the expulsion hearing. It's clearly a violation.
So this extra legal process, essentially.
Right. And what they call it is they're adding to the administrative record. And then because they're saying the school district used this evidence when considering their decision, it should be added on the record. But in reality, the client didn't even get a chance to view this other evidence that they considered.
Chris, how about you as well? Because you also work on the appeal side in addition to all your other work.
Yeah, so I'll just start by saying my expulsion statute is useless. So I try to do as little of that work as possible, actually. Yeah. And so, I moved to Knoxville from Houston, Texas about a year ago. I'm a native Tennessean. I'm not trying to say anything bad about my home state because I love my home state. There's a reason I'm back. But my supervisor, Chris Kleiser in Knoxville, makes fun of me because she feels like every word out or every sentence out of my mouth is, but in Texas, we did it this way.
Right.
And Texas actually had a really progressive education code with a really well-defined statute. So I found that my kids had a lot more rights when we were appealing through the process. But I'll be honest with you, in Tennessee, everything is up to principal's discretion. So I've got a kid whose case I'm working on right now who was expelled 56 days last semester for a cell phone violation. The year before that, this kid was expelled for over 90 days for a cell phone violation. I'm not talking about anything weird with this, like she just was texting on her cell phone. I'll give you one guess to guess what race this student is. But even though the code of conduct says that a cell phone violation is supposed to be at maximum 3 days of out of school suspension, which that's crazy in and of itself. Let's not look too closely at that. The code of conduct also says that these are just guidelines and that principals are really empowered to do what they will. And so what I find my work is actually about is, and I promise this isn't a tangent, I think that my work is actually about health. Mm-hmm. And so in our program, what we often say is that we're basically defenders of a child's right to a healthy adolescence. And what does a healthy adolescence look like, right? A big part of that is the right to go to school, the right to figure out who you are and what you're going to be in the future. And so I often find that I'm, trying to pull leverage from other systems. The one small silver lining about juvenile justice involvement is the schools are scared of the courts too. And so if I can get our juvenile court judge to order something or give an injunction or something like that, I think that could be a really powerful lever against the schools. I do a lot with healthcare. So I take my kids to healthcare appointments because a lot of my kids haven't had access to good care. But I'm taking my kids to to meet psychologists, to do a behavioral health intake, to pediatricians, because I can come back to a school disciplinary hearing and say, look, you don't know this, but actually this kid has PTSD and a pretty significant trauma history. Let's talk about how that impacted this moment. And sometimes I can get an administrator who will listen to that, and then they'll use their discretion for good. But if we're talking about formal procedures in my state, they are essentially non-existent. And we really have to make these soft arguments.
Absolutely. So I'm hearing, health sort of as an input, if you will, as well as an output, because certainly education, many would say, is a social determinant of health as well, right? Okay.
I love you using the social determinants framework. There we go. That's exactly it. Yeah.
There we go. I studied right before, because I knew I was going to talk to you. So I made sure I studied before meeting with you. So So Angela, and you highlighted this, right? And so really at the front end of this, well, I won't even say front end of the system, really the back end of the system as well. But before reentry, we're again representing youth and delinquency proceedings. But I really, again, you mentioned today representing a client who was charged in this water throwing incident. You didn't tell us what crime your child was charged with. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about that. But again, and talk more about your work in any way that you want.
Sure. Yeah. So it was disorderly conduct for, I guess, causing alarm by throwing water and possibly starting a fight. So we'll see if they can make that stick. But just the fact that we were in court for something as minor as that just speaks to kind of what we're seeing, because like Chris said, I'll give you one guess to the race of that particular child. I don't want to, I see a lot of similar things as our other panelists as well, so I don't want to repeat too much. But here in Cincinnati, in terms of what we see in school pushout, our local Ohio ACLU actually did a study on school pushout with our biggest public school system, Cincinnati Public School, and found that Black students are 10.5 times more likely to be put into an alternative learning center, 21 times more likely to be put in an alternative placement, 5 times more likely to be facing emergency removal, 6 times more likely to receive out of school suspension. So then that goes on and on, right? It's like the disproportionate ways that kids are being separated from school and also just not getting equal education are just the magnitude of it is really pretty stunning. And then we see them in the system, right? It's used against them, like Brittany said, well, we're going to keep you from going to school because you're not going to school. When we look at cases where kids are facing transfer, you look at educational history, and again, it gets held against you, right? That you, even though you're going to a school that perhaps was not as resourced as a school that is predominantly white, or in a suburb where, your parents can afford the absurd housing prices in a particular neighborhood, then you have much more of a chance to not experience push out and all the things that happen after that. And we also see with charges and detention disruption, the same things here. Your education's disrupted, you miss more school, whether it's because you have to go to court or you're in detention, you're getting education. We see a lot of packets where we are too. And then the translation of your homeschool and what work you were supposed to be doing there to the detention center and then back again is also a pretty difficult process to navigate. And what in my role or in our division, we have expanded our defense model to be more holistic. And so we're under a current grant where we are partnering with the Children's Law Center to provide like targeted holistic civil legal services. So a big piece of where we see the education issues. Those are the biggest issues that come up when we meet with our clients. And this I've seen in both my prior work with Children's Law Center and now is that parents are not properly educated by the schools about what their rights are in the educational context. Unfortunately, even the most well-meaning of principals and school officials who are dealing with disciplinary issues also seem to be, maybe they're just under capacity or just don't have the capacity to properly administer, the very weak laws that we have protecting education anyways. So just by way of an example, a young person who I have for, not school related issues, I see a lot of has a history of getting multiple suspensions and things like that. And it has a great principal who very much has a heart for the kids that they serve and have in their minds been doing everything they can to keep the kid in school. But, this whole pattern of suspension after suspension has led to my client being in places where they will be contacted by the police, unfortunately. Oh. And a parent who didn't know that this meeting that we were having was supposed to be a manifestation determination hearing, didn't know what this was, didn't even get notice of one that happened, or it didn't even happen. And so, and that's a school where I think the educators really care. They try to shield their kids from the policing involvement, but even then, just are, because of underfunding and everything else, just do not have the capacity to properly communicate. And I think any parent who doesn't know their rights for their kids are just easily swept along with like whatever's easiest, which is to send them to an alternative school, which is what happened in that
Right.
particular case.
Right. So again, getting back to the need for legal representation, right, of the family, just not only to inform them, but also then to help meet the rights that they are owed. And we have a comment from Kayla Beckworth in the chat, who recently had a child charged with criminal trespass because he refused, quote unquote, refused to leave the lunchroom when he was told. So again, just sort of fast track, if you will, to the juvenile and criminal legal system. So all of you, certainly in your opening remarks and since then as well, have talked about some of the racial demographics of your clients. And I'm just wondering if there's anything to add, you wanted to add about, possible issues of intersectionality that you may see in your client population. So race, gender identity, sexual orientation, as well as disability status, and how you see that all sort of coming together, if you will, in the most negative way possible in the clients that you see. So I'm not calling on any of you in particular, but to the extent any of you want to touch on that, please do so.
I can jump in on that. I mean, disability for sure is a huge part of that, right? A huge percentage of the kids that we serve in our office have individualized education plans, so have been found to have a disability. And actually that reminds me of something I wanted to bring up, which is the existence of these behavioral schools, right? Where, a kid cannot, I guess, according to a school district, function appropriately in the normal school setting. And then they send all these kids to a school that specializes in IEPs. Well, you can guess like who goes there. Does it get policed? Of course it does. And then your protections are even less because these are private schools that don't necessarily get held to the same standards. And so that is just another way that I think that our kids, especially the kids with disabilities, are getting pushed out and getting a less than equal opportunity.
Sort of what Taufik was saying before about sort of these schools are almost pushing these alternative schools, right? Smaller class settings, more individualized attention, et cetera. But obviously not in any way talking about the costs, of transitioning out of this, their homeschool settings as well. All right, so are there any trends now that you're seeing with regard to the types of charge offenses that are imposed on your clients, and particularly in light of social media? Chris, you talked about cell phones, but just, during remote instruction and students who are on Zoom, and at least I've seen students, be charged with all sorts of offenses, perceived threats, if you will, sort of during remote instruction. So wondering if you've seen any trends along any of those lines in your practice lately.
I can jump in. I had something that was coming up a lot we saw in detention, particularly during the pandemic, right? Because this is so much now when the instruction was going virtual. Kids in detention, we were trying to figure out how are we going to ensure they access education. So at first it was packets. And then, to our local agency's credit, they were ensuring young people had tablets. Well, when I tell you, I love working with young people. They are so much smarter than I will ever be. And that particularly showed up as to their capacities and capabilities with technology. I think all of our kids in detention just need to become coders. Like when I tell you, these kids were able to get around firewalls, if that's the right word. I don't even know if I'm using this terminology right? Like they were able to get around different barriers that were put up on these tablets to do very human things like send a message to their mom because they were locked up for so long, right? Simple things like that, reaching out to the outside world during a terrifying pandemic was getting kids penalized in detention. And I'm talking about, this is what I often saw in the detention setting, right? And to the point, what would happen as a result, then they would take away the tablet from that young person. So they're taking away the, alternative, right, to in-person instruction taking that away and then handing them again these packets that they weren't able to really receive educational access through. So that was something that just horrified me throughout parts of the pandemic. And you know, something that we really tried to spin and just say, look a minute, how wonderful is it that our young folks are talented to do things like this, right? They outsmarted all of the adults, all of your tech folks who said, oh, this is going to work, rather than say, why don't we invest in coding programs or invest in technology opportunities for our young people to further expand this skill, or, you know, find ways to develop them in that way. Things like that didn't happen. We focused on causing more penalties for things that were really just human things, you know, kids trying to reach out to community. Also, I would say, you know, what we would see for our clients who were home after detention, stays in detention, we would just see just kind of the challenges, right? It's hard. We're on webinar right now because we're all in different places. We are all adults. Our brains are, you know, fully developed, hopefully. Sometimes I need a little caffeine or something to wake me up. So I'm not sure how functional I am right now, but you know, it can be challenging for us to be on a Zoom screen all day. So
Sure.
Kids were getting in trouble for falling asleep for being on Zoom, and maybe being marked absent because of that. It's just, you know, so many things just cycling on and on that seemed like these educational settings were just finding ways to penalize young people for things that just seemed really normal and normative behaviors, particularly for young people.
Well, thank you for that.
I'm going to jump in here because Brittany said like normative behavior for young people, right? And I think one of the normal things that young people do is like run their mouths, right? Because especially middle schoolers, this is like a natural thing that middle schoolers do, right? And what's, you know, been the big issue in our jurisdiction of late are what in Tennessee we call threats of mass violence. When in Texas, that would have been a terroristic threat. You know, I know jurisdictions have all different names for this, but what we're seeing here, you know, our statute basically allows a kid to be charged if they basically make any statement recklessly that two or more people might perceive could cause serious bodily harm. So again, I'm in Knoxville. This is a small city. We've had about 50 arrests for threats of mass violence in a school district that has 60,000 students. Right, so that's actually a pretty high number, and it's about.
Can I ask over what time period? I'm sorry, over what?
Just this school year.
Wow. Okay.
And so that's twice. That's more than twice the number we had last school year, and it's escalated even more since, you know, the Covenant shooting in Nashville, because of course that was very close to home for us. But, you know, what are these threats that kids are making? It's, you know, they tend to fall into two camps that we're seeing. One are, you know, middle school students who are kind of, you know, out on the playground or whatever, like on basketball court or whatever, kind of getting it, you know, frustrated with their friends and saying something like, man, I'll kill you, right? Like, oh no, that's a threat of mass violence. 2 people heard it. We're going to arrest immediately. And our sheriff's department will even come in because the, you know, administrator will hear about this hours after it happens. They'll call the police that afternoon, and the police might spend 2 or 3 days trying to figure out who on the playground said this thing so they can go and arrest the kid and then haul them into detention. And in Tennessee, it's a mandatory hold. So that kid is going to be going to detention and be held. Basically the only misdemeanor level mandatory hold. What's especially scary for us is also now our legislature, right after the Covenant shooting, passed a new statute that's going to make you know, threats of mass violence a mandatory zero tolerance 180-day expulsion for students as well. So next school year, because our laws come into effect in July, I'm very afraid that we're going to see not only more kids charged, but now we're going to have, you know, this large body of kids who are going to be expelled entirely from school. And again, remember in Tennessee, those kids do not necessarily have a right to go even to an alternative school. I have many kids who are just sitting at home for the length of their expulsion, receiving no education. And so I think it's really terrifying to think about what impact that's going to have.
Wow. And again, getting back to Brittany's point about the long-term trajectory of higher education and what this future, I mean, future's then pretty much set in that way, right? So, wow. All right, so really connected to that theme, and Chris, appreciate you touching on the school shooting and the tragic shooting in Nashville about a month or so ago. And Brittany alluded to this earlier about resources that are sort of resources that are focused on law enforcement and police sort of in schools. And certainly many equate school safety with law enforcement presence. Whenever there's a tragic school shooting like there was in Nashville last month rather, one common response is we need more police in schools. I live in Maryland and my son's in high school, and 2 years ago, my county actually voted they removed the police from schools, and there was a couple incidents last year and they put the police right back in the school. So whenever there's any kind of violent episode in the school, again, response is often more police in school. So what is your response? And Angela and Tawfiq, can start with you, but what is your response to the call for more law enforcement in school, particularly as it's connected to school safety? That is, is there do you see a disconnect, if you will, between school safety and an increased law enforcement presence in school?
You want to go first, Tawfiq?
Go ahead.
There's a huge disconnect, right? For obvious reasons. Like, we've been doing the school police and schools thing, and has it changed? No, it's actually, we've just seen more incidents, right? And so that has not changed because it's preventing the community from looking at the root causes of why is a kid bringing a gun to school? Why are, what's happening here? We in our community see a lot of kids bringing guns to school, maybe not necessarily threatening anybody or things like that, but like, what is the driving behavior? Like, what is driving that particular choice, right? Is it curiosity? Are you scared for your safety for some reason? Or it could be a whole world of underlying reasons, but instead we expel, right? Because almost every school has just like basically if you bring a gun to school, you are just out for
it's federal law. Yeah,
absolutely. Right. So you're just gone, and so you have no services, and you have no school, and then what are we perpetuating, right? So we have not solved the problem at all, and we haven't made anybody safer by bringing officers into school. We've only increased the likelihood of Black and brown youth having police contact for things that they shouldn't be having contact for. So yeah, it doesn't make any sense. It hasn't fixed anything in the past, and it won't fix anything now.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to add, like, the biggest thing when we're talking about safety issues, I think, is just restorative practices and get into the root cause of why there's safety. There are safety issues, and why kids do feel compelled to bring guns in schools. A lot of the reasons because of they feel unsafe going to school, commuting in school, and then they bring attention to why they feel unsafe to trusted adults in the school, and sometimes that's not being met, or the safety issues, they still don't feel like it's being resolved. And a lot of the times, like you said, it's not supposed to be, especially here in Chicago, it's not supposed to be zero tolerance policies, SB 100 enacted, whereas if there is a gun in school, school administrators, they do have discretion not to expel or push out those students. But the law does give them a year minimum, but then again, they do have discretion to lessen the punishment. And a lot of the times I feel as though, like, the school and the adults in the building are not getting to the root cause of why there was a gun in the school, why there was a threat. I had a particular case where a middle schooler was basically copying a trend on TikTok. Social media plays a huge part a lot of times in these circumstances. And he was just repeating a TikTok video of some of his friends, or some people he thought were his friends. And he was a new student, and he thought it was something to do to be cool, and it alerted some students and caused some disruption. But again, sometimes these schools, they follow these protocols where they're just taking these kids and putting them in these emergency placement schools. And a lot of the times they're not really assessing or investigating the root cause of why the kid did what they did. that time when they do assess and figure it out, it's a little bit too late because they've already spent about 30 days in detention or 30 days in behavioral schools.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I did neglect to mention to everyone, to the audience, that at around 4:15 or so, we will move to Q&A. And so to the extent there are questions, please put them in the chat, because we really want to hear from you. And Brittany, I was struck when you were talking earlier about taking funding away from special education teachers, right, the schools in the district, and then investing more money in law enforcement. And certainly that's what we see, across the country when we look at guidance counselors and nurses and other medical professionals vis-a-vis law enforcement. And sort of, we could talk about sort of the injustice of budgets, but didn't know if you had more to say in light of this conversation here about law enforcement, just to sort of get back to some of the thoughts you had before.
Yeah, I would just say absolutely agree with Angela and Taufeeq. Police, my clients, young people in DC, young people regularly tell us police are not the ones who make them feel safer, right? So if we're talking about this notion of public safety and safety in schools, when we have the young people themselves, right, being very honest and upfront, and a lot of these are kids who may have safety concerns, who do not feel safe. And right, we talked about sometimes do carry a weapon because that makes them feel safer. But the people who aren't making them feel safe are the ones who are supposed to be there to protect and serve. So something's got to give. Who are those entities that are making young people feel safe? It's like you mentioned, right? The guidance counselor or the teacher who they have a good relationship with, their basketball coach who sits and spends time with them and pours into them and isn't there to be a policing force, right? It's a trusted adult or trusted somebody in their life that they can go to and rely on, right? It's important for all young people to have that. The other thing, Taufeeq mentioned it in his comments, and I just really, wanted to lift this up. The importance of restorative justice practices are truly transformative, right? Like they can bring about such a drastic change and really, again, get to this issue, the root cause as to why things are happening, and creating a scenario in which folks can heal, right? And police aren't the people who are providing those spaces to do that in the same way, right? Historically and modern day police, we have seen on media regularly, our kids have experienced, they have created a lot of harm, and they've got a lot of power and are put in these trusted positions to create safety, but our young people haven't received that. So instead of providing more police or over policing young people, pouring resources and opportunities for restorative practices to focus on healing and addressing and transforming the systems that have caused harm and continue to oppress, that's what we should focus on.
So Chris, I'll turn to you with the next question, and then I'll turn to others as well. And so obviously a big part of our jobs are to tell stories and to put forth narratives to counter narratives that we see out there that are essentializing and criminalizing our clients. And just wanted you to talk a bit about how you see your role and in the work that you do, painting narratives that you want others to grab onto. Just the importance of that to your work.
That's a really great question. So I think in my practice that looks kind of two ways. One is, of course, telling the individual client story. And I think, as you know, I'm assuming most of our audience are frontline defenders who are very, very skilled in that. But there's another kind of storytelling that I think we need to do. And I noticed on our kind of pre-call notes that one of the things we're supposed to think about is how to, advance practice going forward and kind of give people some concrete tips about what they can do. And so one thing that I actually want to encourage everybody to do is to look at your data. especially if you are in a large institutional public defender office, you have access to a lot of data that nobody else has. And it may not be in a usable form yet, especially if you're using, kind of, I think most of us probably have pretty cruddy case management systems. We do. Not hating on defender data, but defender data, I'm hating on it. But there are things that you can do. And so let me give you a really concrete example. When I first got to my new position here in Knox County, it was summertime. And what I did was I just went back and literally kind of hand tabulated the past year's arrests that were coming out of schools, because I wanted to see if I could notice any trends in that data. And that was a pain, right? Because I had to kind of hand tabulate a spreadsheet, but that's work that an intern could have done, right? Like we could go out, and it doesn't even have to be a law student intern, right? There are social science interns in universities, undergrad, grad level across the country who would probably be interested in doing that kind of work. And what I noticed was that, so 25% of our arrests were coming from schools. Of those 25%, basically 50% were coming from 2 schools. Right. So immediately I know where I can try to target my advocacy. One of those schools was our alternative school. Maybe that's not surprising, but out of their arrests, they had like 60 arrests out of that school. All but 4 were for disorderly conduct, which in our state is defined in part as being unreasonably noisy. And it was all one cop, right, who was doing all the arresting. And so immediately, just by going through that, I know, I'm going to start to target my advocacy, right? Maybe we can think about filing a complaint on that one cop, right? Maybe we can think about doing some soft, kind of like policy type discussions with school board members or with school officials. You can bet that coming into juvenile court, right, we're going to start to think about how we can help the judge start to understand the narrative that anything that comes out of this school, if you've got a school that has 90 kids and 60 arrests, that's a huge issue, right? And there's a story there that I think we can tell about a population of clients who attend X school, clients in Y neighborhood, right? That if we really look closely at the information that kind of the aggregate information that we have about our clients, yeah, we can tell those individual stories, but we can also tell a community story as well. And I think we need to do both.
Thank you so much. Brittany, same question. Just about narratives and stories and
Yeah, I'm smiling a little bit because I love to hear Chris talk about data. I know he loves it so much. And I may need to call him in later and have him do some technical assistance for our team to think through how to really track our data better. Yeah, but for this storytelling piece, it's interesting. I was having a conversation earlier this week with some other advocates, and one of the things that we discussed is how oftentimes defense attorneys, myself included, I'm really, really worried to have my clients specifically speak to folks, right? Because of confidentiality and the importance of that, and truly believe young people should have an opportunity to really go beyond this juvenile system. But one of the conversations we had recently was thinking through, right? How do we ensure that young people get to tell their own stories, right? We're all attorneys here talking about young people and sharing, anecdotes about our young folks, but truly the most powerful voice in all of this is from the young person who has experienced it themselves. I don't have an answer as to how best to do that, because it's something I struggle with very regularly in advising clients. Please do not speak to press, do not speak to these people, don't speak to these people. We got to protect all of these things. But I do think, there are times, particularly once cases are resolved or once clients are, post-disposition or maybe post-case closure, and in safe spaces, quite frankly, where they're able to share about their journeys as to what this looked like. I think those are the best storytellers, and those the young people themselves who have had that direct experience are the ones to help push this narrative and explain what this system has looked like, right? So I say that and just name that, I love telling my client stories in the hopes of, right, us all, we do that and helping to change hearts and minds so people hear us and we start to see change. One thing I think is interesting and that our team is doing, and we were actually reached out to by someone at a school locally who is pretty disheartened to see the amount of times folks in her school are contacting the police for young people in the school setting. So she's, trying to create a space to do a police-free school teach-in. I'm so excited that she, reached out to us and asked us to do this, but it's got me, thinking now, and those wheels are turning as to how can defenders, how can education advocates, how can we as, youth advocates reach out to schools and try and pour in that message, right? How do we go into schools and help folks understand this, sharing these stories, so what we see in our work, so we can tell how these disruptions impact in the longer term effects. And I also think the stories are so important to tell at higher levels, like school boards or local, various, local education agencies and things like that. I'm so excited. Liz Ryan was here earlier. She's the best person that can have this job, and is sharing so much, and hopefully, she continues to have a great impact. But, I think in all those different kinds of ways and spaces are how we get the narrative out and sharing client stories. And yeah.
And maybe to legislators as well, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Appreciate that. Okay. How about Angela and then Tawfiq? Same question, a similar question, just stories, narratives, but also connected to Chris's point about advice you would provide to the audience along these lines about just elevating these issues, amplifying these issues as well.
Yeah, certainly agree with everything that's already been said, especially the data piece, which we are also struggling through. But I think when you have it, certainly raise it in all the places that you can, right? Even if it's in an amenability evaluation, and there's mention of how many police contacts there have been. Well, let's talk about how much more Black youth in our community are being policed. But you can change the narrative in as micro of a way of like showing up at a school meeting where a principal is quite sure that your client's out selling drugs, and flip that narrative to disrupt it and say, well, this kid wants to make money and is very entrepreneurial. So what can we do to funnel that, right? How can we build on those positive capacities to really turn them to a different direction? So it could be as small as that, or just showing up and being in those spaces. So like Brittany said, that there may be somebody in those systems at school who will want to try something new, and you can be part of it. So I think for defender offices, especially, to be in the community, to be present in the spaces where people are making those decisions, it's really important. And being aligned with community members that are trying to push change is a really important way to start shifting that narrative. And one thing that I'm personally not good at right now, but hope to develop capacity individually and for our office, is to be doing more social media and media presence about these issues and educating the public. And then the last piece I'll add is we have a participatory defense hub that partners with us, and that is also a great way of bringing the community in to help your client tell their story in a really kind of grassroots type of way. And so that is another area that you might invite community members to support your kid and their family in sharing their story, painting a more robust picture of who they are and their experience.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, I'll just add that I second everything that everyone said. And I just want to continue to emphasize restorative practice, restorative justice practices, and how it comes down to just fostering positive relationships between the adults and the young people. And one of the things I like to lean on is community organizations that are like kind of the grassroots on the ground. And, here in Chicago, we have a number of community organizations that have mentorships, have job training, have programs, positive programs for these young people. And they know these young people, they're in their world, and they can help them tell their story. And sometimes, when families are, education, they're just dealing with a plethora of other issues, whereas sometimes that advocating for their child's rights in the school aspect is just low priority to them. So they're dependent on these community organizations that have these relationships with these students to come into the schools and talk to these administrators, talk to these principals, talk to these student counselors, and really paint the picture for that student's narrative. And that's where the sense of trust develops, and we can continue to have positive engagement in schools, and that's what really keeps students in school and willing to come to school and continue to do right and continue to the path of graduation. So I stress that restorative justice practices and just really honing in on fostering positive relationships and keeping those relationships, because those are the people that are going to come up and back for you when it's needed.
All of this sounds really, really great, and certainly has me energized and excited. So one last question before we turn to the Q&A. And it's it's always important to end sort of on a high note. So can you each share one success that you have had recently? And if you can't find something very recent, just a success that you had that has continued to push you, right, to strengthen you as you do this work. So whoever wants to go first.
I'll go because I actually had one that I became aware of very recently. So this goes back to my time in Houston. So several years ago now, I represented a middle school student who'd been arrested at school in a special education, 100% special education behavior classroom. So she spent all her time there, and she, threw something at a teacher and they charged her with aggravated assault, basically. And so I got involved in that child special education case. And of course, we got the school case dismissed very quickly because it was a manifestation, but we ended up having to file due process, which is the dispute resolution mechanism in IDEA. So we were going to have a little trial about her special education and about whether she really needed to be in that behavior classroom period, because of course she really wanted to be back in the mainstream school, especially moving into high school, so that she could play sports and do all those things that kids get to do. We were able to get a really great resolution for that case. We were able to work her out of the behavior classroom. She started high school. I hadn't heard from them in years, but I got a text message about 2 days ago from her mother that said that she had graduated actually this year, and graduated early, and that she had been able to play sports and do all the things that she had wanted, and that high school was actually a really wonderful experience for her. And so, especially being here in the throes of some pretty dark cases in Tennessee, where we are definitely in the dark ages of special education, that was really good to hear this week. And I think it also reminded me of the importance of doing this intersectional work, how the school case and the juvenile case are actually very interrelated.
That's terrific. Thank you, Chris.
I like to add a recent win. Well, it's not a recent win, but the client is graduating in about a week. But it was a process, whereas they were accused of bringing a gun to school, and not to get into the facts and details of the incident, it was originally held not a manifestation of his disability, but then we filed a due process, and then we began negotiating with the school district, and they realized that it should have been a manifestation of a disability, and then the client didn't continue to go to that school, went to another school, found appropriate placement, and now on the verge of graduating. And back then he wasn't, but he was able to recover his credits in due time, took evening school, and now is on the path to go to college. And it's good work.
Terrific. All right, Angela or Brittany, whoever wants to go first.
I'll just say really quickly, the win was a while ago, but the client texted me today, so I'm going to celebrate it again.
That's great.
Wow.
It was everlasting, right? So
Yeah.
absolutely, yeah.
He had a client who they had a lot of challenges in school, a lot of frustrations, and we're constantly getting blowback. I don't even know if I could say I was the attorney. I feel like I was co-counsel to my client, because let me tell you, they were their greatest advocate, and they addressed things when they felt like they weren't being treated fairly. So I was just kind of co-signing things for them. But at their graduation, these barriers and impact, barriers along the way, came down to the very last minute. My client was told, because they were in detention, they had to wear clothes that other male youth were wearing. My client's gender expression was that of female. And, the facility said, nope, you can't do that. I'm like, are you kidding me? This amazing young person worked so hard for so long, and now we're going to have to fight you on a separate civil rights issue, on allowing client to dress accordingly to their gender expression. So, had to send a kindly worded email explaining how they were violating the law. And then client did get to dress as they wanted. And to Taufik's earlier point about connecting people with also a strong adult person, maybe who's had similar experience, they had a mentor who also had been system involved. And because she was just so excited and also so frustrated that they tried to fight our client along the way, brought a little container of glitter. And when I tell you, just threw glitter all over our client, making a huge mess that the staff ended up cleaning up, but we were so excited because the staff who had to clean it up were the people who had been oppressing our kid for so long. So my client texted me again today, simply just to say, thank you for being along my journey. And they got a new job as a manager at McDonald's. So
Awesome.
yay.
Angela.
Okay, so this is just the most recent thing that I think is it's a small win, but win in of itself, is that we had a young person who, again, the charge is unrelated to school, but was experiencing a lot of the suspensions and expulsion, or was on the brink of expulsion for a recent incident, but has an IEP. They had not done the appropriate, they actually hadn't even updated the IEP, unfortunately. Kind of just missed that, and they were due. So by having one of our holistic defense team members, one of our social workers, as part of the school meeting and getting him representation, the win for me is that this young person who, the first few meetings we had was really angry, kind of just like feeling like everyone had given up on him, had already judged him for, what they think he's up to, and that he's bad news at school. Like, I could see it all over his face in the way he presented, because he wanted to keep telling us that he didn't care, but he did care. You could tell how much he cared, that, he might get expelled and he might not get to go back to school. And so by having being there and having a team for that child and speaking up for him, first, we're getting things righted. And I think that has encouraged him to know that there's people in his corner. And then the last couple of interactions have been just completely different. Just he's invested again, because we're invested. And so I think just showing up and being there and letting your clients know that you're in their corner and they feel like they have that support network can be huge.
Thank you so much, and thank you all. So turn it over to Katrina.
Yeah, speaking on kind of related to that last point you made, Angela, one of our audience members was wondering, do any of your states have laws regarding when students with an IEP are arrested for things that are products of their disability?
We do in Tennessee. It's actually one of our few good statutes. Under the Special Education Behavioral Supports Act, schools are supposed to hold a manifestation before they file a petition in juvenile court. And of course, if it's found to be a manifestation, they're not allowed to file the petition, basically. In practice, that has almost no effect. So if you get the official juvenile court data from our juvenile court, you will see that schools have filed 0 petitions in our juvenile court in the past year. So there are no school-based cases officially coming into our juvenile justice system. Now, actually, 25% of the cases are. So what happens? They just have the cop file the petition for them. And so they're technically complying with the law because the school isn't filing the petition, right? Knoxville Police Department is filing the petition. And so that actually happens in many of the districts in Tennessee. So it's had, unfortunately, almost no practical effect on that problem.
I wanted to make space if anyone else wanted to answer. If not, there are a couple other questions as well. Okay, so Leslie Jones, one of our fabulous ambassadors for racial justice, she was wondering if you all are aware of any PD offices teaming up with civil rights organizations to support data gathering. For example, Southern Poverty Law Center has worked with consultants to request and review, analyze school discipline data. So wondering about that. And then part two, also thinking about youth voice through storytelling. Southern Poverty Law Center has an educational magazine, which serves as a safe space and helps educators understand the impact of their decisions on students long-term. So two-part question. One, thinking about data gathering, does it make sense to work with civil rights organizations? Is that something you've heard of? And then part two, how do we get youth voice out there to explain in their own words what's going on to them in schools?
Go ahead, Tuffy.
No, I was just gonna say for the data gathering, no, I office, not that I'm aware of, is partnering with any civil rights organization, but I do know we do have a partnership with University of Chicago in their crime labs division, where they do share data with us. But the second part question, I'm sorry, what was that again?
Yeah, what are some ways maybe to get youth voice involved and get the stories out? You all shared some really profound stories and just frustrating stories about what your clients are going through. So thinking about ways to get youth voice out there about what's been happening to them.
So I do know we have a community organization called Story Catchers, where they work with youth and they come up with plays and other ways to create creative content where they to share their experience and through that mechanism or medium.
Is that online, Telfi? Story Catchers? Is it something that is available to the public?
Yes, let me find their website and drop it in the chat.
Thank you so much. Anyone else?
I was just going to add, we also have a local organization called Black Swan Academy that really focuses in DC on bringing youth voices and stories to light. And they are actually the ones that I would say are to thank for our recent legislation that's pulling police out of schools. So again, these local organizers, right? These grassroots folks hearing directly from young people are the ones who have been making changes. As for civil rights organizations, I think absolutely it's important, it's necessary to partner with those orgs, especially in thinking as to not just data, but what can lead from that, right? Like what can attorneys do? Are we creating lawsuits? Are we doing things? So there are in DC some, particularly some education organizations that are partnering with an organization called Washington Lawyers Committee, and they do civil rights work and are doing greater litigation to impact this educational space. So I think it is a really important and effective tool that works and creates great results.
Well, I see we're coming up on time. Thank you all so much for being here. Really, you all are very, very busy running clinics, defending students. Thank you all so much for being here and for your time. Thank you to our audience members. Of course, thank you to Administrator Liz Ryan. It was great to have her here and hear about some of the great work that they all are doing on the school to prison pipeline. I'll end with, there are a few links in the chat, so be sure to check those out. And I will also include a link to our new brief. It's called Defending Students Who Have Been Stopped, Searched, and Interrogated. So very important for defenders out there and just understanding. Amy, if you don't mind putting that in the chat. Perfect. Thank you. And thank you all so much for being here and hope to see you all soon. Yes, Christina, there is a recording and it will be on our YouTube page. Thank you all.